We have two speakers here. Latsina starts with, because futuristic science fiction does not need to represent current social realities, its writers can envisage radically new social arrangements. I immediately actually thought of some of the Heinlein that I've read. It is futuristic science fiction, and it does break from current social realities in a lot of ways. I mean, he was, very forward thinking. For example, women in power. Like, you read his books and, you'll have a woman president of the galactic whatever. And he was writing this in 1950, which was, a big break from the current social arrangement. I'm allowed to bring in that outside information, that outside knowledge, right? As to the extent that it helps me understand what Lucina is saying. I'm not meant to like shut off my entire life experience, right? I'm allowed to go, oh yeah, I guess you're right. They do sometimes do this in futuristic sci-fi. Again, Lucina has said, because futuristic sci-fi does not need to represent current social realities, its writers can envisage, which means, imagine, radically new social arrangements. Thus, okay, so that was a premise basically, and here comes a conclusion. Thus, sci-fi has the potential to be a richer source of social criticism than is conventional fiction. The first thing I noticed there is that they're bringing up new shit in their conclusion.
New shit, yeah.
Which you're just not allowed to bring up new shit in your conclusion. That's like on the LSAT 10 commandments.
Yeah, I would say if if there is any such flaw that we want people to remember other than necessary versus sufficient, maybe confusing necessary for sufficient and confusing correlation for causation, it's probably just bringing up new shit, because even in your those conclusion, two examples,
specifically in your conclusion,
yes,
you're not, thou shalt not bring up new shit in your conclusion. That doesn't work.
It doesn't work. And it subsumes so many flaws, right? Essentially, that's what they're doing. Even when you go from correlation to causation, you were talking about correlation, and now you're bringing up new shit, which is
causation.
Causal relation. Yep.
Is new shit. Exactly. Yeah. You know what? I've never really articulated it this way before. And now when I think about it, like, I think I've seen LSAC describe it as unwarranted assumption or something like that. But it's such a more straightforward way to communicate it, to just say, don't bring up new shit in your conclusion. That is not going to work. I'm willing to grant you all of your premises, so you can bring up as much new shit as you want in your premises. But when you get to the conclusion, I want no new shit in there. Otherwise, I'm going to immediately attack. And so what would you say here, Ben, if you were just going to like jump all over Latsina? Because she's committed, the LSATs, that's probably a bigger deal actually than confusing sufficient for necessary.
Yeah, that would cover a ton of flaws.
Yeah. So what are you going to do then? I mean, she's just teed herself up for it, right? You get to just now go to town. Yeah. What are you going to say?
Well, okay. So she says in her conclusion that futuristic science fiction has the potential to be a richer source of social criticism. Well, first of all, I don't know anything about social criticism. So I'm like, what makes for good social criticism? Something where you can radically envision a new social arrangement? Is that how you go about criticizing social criticism?
Yeah.
Right? Or criticizing social structures? Or I don't know. Do you actually go after the structures that are in place? I have no clue. This is like all new.
Like you want to be criticizing a not reality is what you're saying.
Yeah.
I mean, she's just wide open for like, as soon as the other side starts talking, she's going to be struggling here. She also brings up other new shit by comparing it to conventional fiction.
Conventional fiction. What do we know about conventional fiction? Can they not also envision radically new social arrangements?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, conventional fiction like The Color Purple or like To Kill a Mockingbird. Wait, like Huck Finn? Wait a second. So you're saying that those are not rich sources of social criticism?
Yeah.
Really?
And if, by the way, for our listeners who are taking issue with the first sentence and saying, hey, but the first sentence said that they could envision radically new social arrangements because it's futuristic science fiction and does not need to represent current social realities. Well, you're confusing sufficient for necessary, right? Just because I, someone can make money through basketball doesn't mean that someone else can't make money through stock trading, right? Like,
Yeah.
so don't think that conventional fiction can't also do this.
We do understand what Lucina is saying. And in fact, I maybe tend to agree with her, not necessarily her conclusion.
Should
All
I
right,
read
Priscilla.
Priscilla?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the other, this is the rebuttal, or at
Yep.
least Priscilla's response. Priscilla says that futuristic science fiction writers more
Yeah.
skillfully envisage radically new technologies than new social arrangements shows how writers' imaginations are constrained by current realities. Okay. So this sentence is awkwardly written, but it's basically saying, in my mind, two things. One, futuristic science fiction writers apparently more skillfully envision I'm going to just use a better word there, envision radically new technologies. They do that better than they envision new social arrangements, right? And that's kind of embedded in this sentence. And apparently that, according to Priscilla, shows how their imaginations are pretty constrained actually by current apparently social realities. And so maybe Priscilla is going to go on and say that they don't envision new social arrangements as much as the first person thinks. I don't
Right.
know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Priscilla already got there and said, well, but they don't really do this very well. Right.
Priscilla, what she was trying to say is that apparently futuristic science fiction writers are better at writing or envisioning new technologies than new social arrangements. And for that, apparently, according to Priscilla, shows us how their imaginations are pretty constrained by current realities, and they can't really see beyond what's right in front of them.
So Priscilla doesn't argue that futuristic science fiction does not need to represent current social realities. Priscilla does not argue that futuristic sci-fi writers can envisage radically new social arrangements. She just says, yeah, but they don't do that nearly as skillfully as they envisage the new technologies. You know, the
Yeah.
laser beams and the warp drives and all that shit. They're good at that. They're actually, according to Priscilla, not as good, less skillful at envisaging these new social arrangements.
Yeah.
So she's not explicitly disagreeing with Lucina's premises, but
Mm-hmm.
she's sort of sidestepping them, right? By saying, yeah, they could. They just don't do it very well.
They don't do it very well, and that does come in between the first person's premise and her conclusion, right? Because now it's like, well, maybe it's not a richer source of social criticism if you assume that you do need to envision radically new social
Right. I
arrangements.
mean, Priscilla, her first sentence could have been, but they're not very good at that.
Yep. She continues, because of this limitation, their inability to see beyond current social realities, the most effective social criticism results from faithfully presenting the current social realities for critical examination, as happens in conventional fiction. Okay, so that's a direct contradiction of, how do you say that first person's name?
Lucina.
Lucina.
Yeah.
Lucina's conclusion. So they clearly disagree about what source of fiction is better.
And we predicted it because Lucina left herself wide open to that attack. She brought up new shit of social criticism and conventional fiction, and Priscilla just turned on that fastball. I mean, that's
Yep.
that one was right down the pipe, and Priscilla put it out of the yard.
Yep.
Right. I mean, she's just like, well, but wait a second. They don't do that very well. And the most effective social criticism comes from faithfully presenting current realities like they do in conventional fiction.
Yep.
I mean, just devastating retort there from Priscilla.
Yeah. The question says Lucina and Priscilla disagree with each other about whether, and I mean, I'm going to make a prediction here. It's just whether or not conventional fiction or futuristic science fiction is better
Yeah.
at criticizing
It's
social
useful
realities.
generally on a disagree question or an agree question. It's useful to think about, are they arguing about evidence, or are they arguing about the conclusion, or are they arguing about both of those things? And here, I don't see Priscilla explicitly disagreeing with any of Lucina's premises. I see
Yeah, that's a very
Priscilla.
good point. Yeah.
I see Priscilla providing new evidence. And, this could have been a method question, right? A reasoning question. But they could have easily just said, what was the strategy of argumentation employed by Priscilla? And in which case it's really critical that you recognize, well, she's not really arguing about the evidence. She did provide new evidence, and she definitely disagreed with Lucina's conclusion.
Yeah, and I think the key word here is Lucina's use of the word can, right? She said they can envisage radically new social arrangements, as opposed to saying that they actually do that often, right? And so
Exactly.
it makes it easy for Priscilla to say, yeah, I agree maybe that they can, but I don't think they do.
Priscilla has said, she just neatly sidestepped. She said, sure. I mean, she didn't even have to say it. She just said, well, yeah, they can do that, but they don't do it very well. Also, you brought up new shit in your conclusion that I'm going to attack specifically.
Yep. Sorry. Last thing you said, it's important to decide whether they're disagreeing about the conclusion, about the evidence, or about both.
Yes.
And I'm glad you said that, because so many people reflexively assume that they're going to disagree about their conclusion. And although they certainly can, and they did here, that often.
Or they reflexively assume that if you do disagree on the conclusion, then you have to also disagree on the evidence. And that's not what happened here. Priscilla didn't argue with any of Lucina's evidence. She just said, hey, I've got other evidence that we need to talk about. And then I'm going to disagree explicitly with your conclusion, but not the evidence. So sometimes they're going to disagree on just the evidence and arrive at the same conclusion. Sometimes they're going to disagree on the conclusion, but not the evidence, like they did here. Other times they are going to disagree with the evidence and then thereby reach a different conclusion.
Yeah. All right. So answer A says, some science fiction writers have succeeded in envisaging convincing radically new social arrangements. Well, Lucina would clearly agree with this. I don't know. I mean, succeeded, yes. And Priscilla might even agree with this. Might say, yes, some have done it. It's happened at least once. I'm not saying that it never happens. I'm just saying it doesn't happen very often. So
she doesn't have to disagree.
Yeah.
We're looking for one where the evidence on the page proves that one of the speakers would say yes to this statement, or not would say, but has said yes to the statement, and the other speaker has said no. I'm willing to grant that Lucina says yes to A, but I'm not willing to grant that Priscilla says no to A. Priscilla could easily say, well, yeah, of course, we've got Robert Heinlein or whoever. Like, we've got a writer who did this successfully. Sure.
But in general, they don't.
I still disagree with your conclusion, because most of them do this less skillfully, and conventional fiction, and the new evidence, which was the most effective social criticism, results from faithfully presenting the current social realities.
Yeah.
Therefore, conventional fiction is actually better. She doesn't have to disagree with A. Yeah.
Doesn't have to disagree with A. Let's keep it there. B, Writers of conventional fiction are more skillful than our writers of futuristic science fiction. Yeah, it's going way too broad. We're talking about their abilities to skillfully envisage radically new technologies or arrangements or things like that. This is just like skillful, period. And we don't know. So I would say I don't know for either one of these.
Exactly, because Lucina never even mentioned skillfulness. So she doesn't have to disagree with B necessarily.
Sure.
Or, I mean, I think she could agree that writers of conventional fiction are more skillful generally. She could be like, well, yeah, it's actually easier to write sci-fi.
Or easier to write conventional fiction. Yeah.
Either way,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter. And Priscilla could actually do the same thing, because more skillful generally is just way too broad. They're arguing about a narrower issue.
Yeah. Cool. C, futuristic science fiction has more promise as a source of social criticism than does conventional fiction. Okay. This is what Lucina was saying in her conclusion. And this is the opposite.
Well, promise and potential mean the same thing. If you have a prospect, you're scouting out your buddies for a 40 and over basketball league, and you've got a buddy who's 6'6". You're like, well, this shows never played basketball before, but the height shows promise, or the height shows potential.
Yeah.
It means the same shit. That if I was teaching this in class, there would be like 5% of the class which was like, well, I couldn't pick it because of promise.
Oh, wow. Well, that just really shows the problem that people have with like zeroing in on keywords.
Word matching.
Anyways, so answer choice C it's got to be the answer. So answer choice D, envisaging radically new technologies rather than radically new social arrangements is a shortcoming of futuristic science fiction. Okay, neither of them talked about this, so I would say it's not a shortcoming. No one discussed it. It's out.
I mean, Priscilla did say they're better at the technologies than at the social arrangements, but even if Priscilla, wait, did I say Lucina? I meant Priscilla if I misspoke. Priscilla did say that they're better at the tech than they are at the social arrangements. But she actually didn't say that they do the tech and they don't do the social arrangements.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is what D's describing.
Yeah.
So we can't even put Priscilla on a yes for D.
Yeah.
And Lucina just didn't really even talk about envisaging radically new technologies. She didn't say that word at all. How could we possibly put her on a yes or a no for D?
Yeah. Well, that in some ways that makes these answers easier to get rid of, right? Like if one person didn't talk about something, then you can just ignore the other.
But yeah, on a agree disagree question, if I can't put both speakers explicitly on a position on that statement, based on their statement, they have to have clearly said yes, and the other one has to clearly have said no. So a foundational thing is they at least both have to have expressed a position on that. Okay.
So D's out. E, criticism of current social arrangements is not effective when those arrangements are contrasted with radically different ones.
Who's doing that? I mean, Lucina says that futuristic sci-fi writers are envisaging radically new social arrangements, but she does not say that they are contrasting those social arrangements with current social arrangements. Well, actually, they're not even criticizing current social arrangements necessarily.
No, they're just telling a story that happens to have radically new social arrangements, which may end up being a richer source of social criticism. But also, we have this problem of not effective. Like that's extraordinarily strong, right? All that Lucina was saying is that it's a richer source. So I'm not saying that's the key to getting rid of this answer choice, but it's yet another problem.
I just don't see Priscilla taking a position on that either.
Yeah.
Priscilla said, hey, sci-fi writers aren't very good at envisaging these radically new social arrangements, but she didn't really take any position on whether criticism of current social arrangements is or is not effective when you contrast it with radically different social arrangements. I mean, she sees the correct answer because Lucina said it explicitly in her conclusion, and Priscilla in her conclusion said the most effective social criticism results from conventional fiction.
Yep.
which is the opposite of that. So Lucina says yes to C, Priscilla says no to C, and that's easily our answer.